When you come into a business, first off, you've got to prove yourself. I came in as finance director, so the first thing I had to resolve was the overdraft and the fact that we were running out of cash. So purpose wasn't in my lexicon then, believe me, Jeff. Vision wasn't in my lexicon. I just was innately wired to grow, and but very practical. So I approached it in the fact that, I'm getting well paid here. I need to tangibly pay for myself and demonstrate how I'm paying for myself very, very quickly. And there were a number of things that we did, accessing grant support, for example, locally to help us develop export markets, help us on product development. So tangibly, he was able to see very quickly that I was paying for myself. I remember having a meeting very quickly with the bank manager as the newly appointed FD, and a week later I was contacting him to say, can we extend our overdraft? He in turn rang the founder and said, who is this guy? He's only in and already he's extending the overdraft. I had learned from my experience in the software industry that ultimately sales is vanity, profit's sanity, and cash is reality. And that, as cliched as that is, that the learning, I was doing cash flow statements every second day for venture capitalists who were calling me every second day to say, what's our cash headroom? What's our burn rate? I knew the importance that cash played within a scaling business. Essentially, it's the oxygen by which scaling businesses survive. So once I had agreed on that overdraft, we navigated out of that within 3 or 4 months and never in our history went back into it again. In fact, prior to leaving, we acquired a 300,000 square foot factory from Caterpillar, who had located in Belfast and were then leaving Belfast, and built 40,000 square foot of new offices in Mid-Ulster, and that was largely paid for from cash. So, we became, through that journey, very cash conscious and cash rich. So the articulation of vision only came a number of years later when I came into the CEO role. And I've always had a desire to understand what the future might look like. I've always informed what I do by the future that I want to create. And I've got language around that now, of course, having spoken to some of the best brains on the planet, having read a lot over the last 10 years, I have a lot of language around this, but I didn't then. But what I always was inspired by were people who had a sense of what they wanted to create in the future, and did that align to the future that I wanted for myself. So that first conversation with the guys about vision was a very practical one, very relatable one, simply saying, guys, I would love for us to grow this business. This is what it could look like. I would love us to become number one in our industry. This is what it could look like. Does that align with what you would like for the business? So it was a conversation where we were getting alignment in what we wanted the future to look like, independently and collectively.
I remember going through with some of my colleagues, business partners, C-suite, saying, I've got this idea, this vision, this is what I think we should do, what we could do. And you get responses like, no, don't waste your time. Let's maximize profit. Let's just focus on profit. Let's sell it as high as we can, buy it as cheap as we can. Let's forget all this. Let's forget volume. Let's forget brand. Let's forget. That's all fluff stuff. Let's just make as much profit as we can in a short space of time. And I said, but where did you say? Well, where does that end up? So the point I was asking you was because for me, it's been very tough. You got people that don't think in an entrepreneurial way. They're a different mindset. They're a very straightforward, employ people. If they don't impress you by day 5, sack them or whatever. It's very, very draconian because that was the way we was all wired. That was the way we believed it should be. Command and control was about authority and carrot and stick, and it was humiliation. It was all these things that we thought got the best out of people that we were clearly getting wrong. So I guess that was, what experiences, if any, did you have on that journey, or was you lucky enough that because you went on that slow journey, you built your own credibility first as FD, which meant you got their attention when you did start saying these things?
Absolutely. So for a number of years, I was compiling the accounts. I was examining the accounts. I was digging into the accounts. I would hear that margins should have been, let's say 30% on a project, but actually by the time I'd completed the accounts, the margins looked more like 17%. So that then triggered and was the catalyst for conversations within the business. So all of a sudden, you have your head stuck in the middle of what's happening in sales and how projects are priced, for example. And then you start to discern that actually, well, you've only included 80% of the true costs of completing that project. And somebody say, oh, well, I was able to do the project for this and this and this, and I say, yeah, the difference is that you were doing that. You were arriving to the warehouse on Saturday, putting the tools into a van, going down, installing the plant, commissioning the plant, and you're not charging yourself for your own time. We're now at a stage where now we're contracting that in, and that needs to be accounted for. The notion that you had a 30% margin 3 years ago when you were doing a lot of this yourself is very different now when we have a team of people that we need to cost into the job. So you engage people with the conversation. I remember even hosting a little class, a little workshop to explain the difference to our leadership team or small management team at that stage, the difference between margin and markup. People didn't understand, getting into the nuts and bolts of how to price a job correctly and accurately, and then seeing it delivered. And whenever it was delivered, you come back and say, guys, we had everything accounted for, but actually the margin is now this. It should have been that plus another 7%. So where did we lose it? So then your head's stuck in operations. And this is the privilege that actually the numbers give you, that, having an innate understanding of the numbers. They are a journey and exploration into every corner of the business. And I think it's no accident that a lot of FDs end up in CEO positions, because ultimately, if they're curious enough to want to know why things are as they are, then they're going to find themselves in every corner of the business, asking lots of questions, making a nuisance of themselves, but trying to support those teams of people to actually achieve better performance. So that was a journey of absolutely gaining credibility initially, Jeff, and then you arrive into a point where you're called in one day and the founder says, look, I'd like you to be the CEO of this business.